A few days ago, I made a video discussing the recent tragedy of Richard Bilkstow's death. Richard was a principal with the Toronto District School Board who recently committed suicide. He was amidst a legal battle with the board over harassment he received in 2021 during a diversity, equity, and inclusion training session. All of the details can be found in my previous video or in news articles from basically every major news agency. The takeaway is that Richard pushed back against some statements a DEI consultant was supporting, and when he disagreed with her publicly, she reprimanded him by saying, "You and your whiteness think that you can tell me what's really going on for Black people." In the events that followed, Richard was chastised in several other sessions, took a leave of absence, and eventually received a workplace health and insurance payout when they found harassment had indeed occurred in the workplace. Richard attributed his inability to later land principal contract positions as fallout from the publicity. In May 2023, he filed suit for damages, which again brought this back into the forefront of media attention. Now, I mentioned earlier that coverage of this story can be found in basically every major news publication. I've read a bunch, and most have provided decent coverage. But 2 days ago, the Toronto Star released an article that shook me. I am actually a paying subscriber to the Toronto Star because I truly believe in the importance of diverse perspectives and taking care to consume media across our entire political spectrum. But this is the sort of article that will make me reconsider my support. The article is written by Shree Paradkar, the controversial social and racial justice columnist at the Toronto Star. Unlike other columns that discuss the nuances of the situation, in this particular column, Shree chose to use Richard's death as an opportunity to stoke inflammatory rhetoric and create racial division. The article opens with the line, "One man's fatal mental health crisis has been co-opted by political opportunists and turned into an attack on anti-racism training while also chillingly targeting one Black woman." And that sentence pretty much sums up the flavor of the entire article. The Black woman referenced, which by the way, she always capitalizes the word Black, which suggests that it is more than just an adjective in this usage, is the DEI consultant who chastised Richard. In the narrow purview of this columnist, the paid DEI consultant who attacked Richard and his whiteness is the one who's being targeted. Now, up front, I do want to recognize that there are some who are literally suggesting that the consultant is directly responsible for Richard's death and should be held criminally liable. That's a rather extreme position to take, and frankly, that's not how our laws work. However, looking at the facts of the case, it is evident that in her position of power as a respected instructor leading the session, she targeted an individual and directed humiliation and ridicule towards him, and allowed this to continue over multiple days. And these are sessions on equity and inclusion, I might remind you. And that is exactly what many people are highlighting in news articles, podcasts, freedom of information requests, and online discussion. They were holding the consultant responsible for what she chose to do, which was to respond extremely rudely to one of the employees she was being paid to instruct, showing negligence in terms of how this might affect his mental health and future outcomes. The Toronto Star author points out that suicides are rarely caused by single factors, in support of her main argument, that the DEI consultant who harassed Richard is being unfairly attacked in this incident. And it's true that suicide is frequently multimodal, and it's certainly possible that applies in Richard's case, though I don't believe it's appropriate for any of us to speculate beyond what the family has shared publicly. But why does it matter if there were other causes at play? Richard professed to those who knew him how much the situation was weighing on him, and we know very clearly the connection between this particular event in Richard's life and what came next. He was publicly humiliated in front of his leadership colleagues, and his superiors did not stand behind him and speak out about the treatment he was subjected to. He was shaken, and there was clear and documented link between the harassment Richard encountered in this session, the way his employer fell behind the consultant with their support, and the downstream deleterious effect on his subsequent employment. Now, there's a word for circumstances, attitudes, and institutional structures that indirectly disadvantage individuals downstream. It's called systematic oppression, and it's a word that originates from the postmodernistic deconstructive thinking that inspires the modern DEI movement. Now, I'm not a fan of interpreting the world that way, but isn't that exactly what Richard encountered here from the consultant, the behavior of his employer, and the mainstream media's coverage of his grievance over the past 2 years? The oppression has been systematic. This word is usually reserved for oppression towards minorities, which absolutely can and does exist. But as it turns out, institutions like the Toronto District School Board and powerful people like high-end DEI consultants can systematically cause oppression to others through their established power imbalance as well, even towards a white man. And that's the point here. Richard asked for TDSB to investigate this situation 2 years ago, and they refused. Only now, in response to the entire province becoming aware of how rudely he was treated while employed by them, have they finally announced they will investigate the circumstances surrounding his death. And what did the Toronto Star columnist write in response to this announcement? Consider this. On the one hand, reams of data show that racism maims and kills, that the system of white supremacy has caused an epidemic of suicides amongst Indigenous people, that the risk of suicide amongst LGBTQ2+ people is rising. On the other hand, an isolated tragedy, contentiously linked to a conversation the anti-racists don't want to have. Guess which of the two the system comes down on? Wow, this has gotten a little heated, so let's just cool the temperature down a little bit. Shree is right that the societal circumstances we have created, the attitudes that have prevailed over many decades, and the system of our institutions have resulted in hardship for people of various ethnicities, indigenous people, and LGBT individuals. She's also right that suicide amongst each of these groups is higher than the general population, and that there's a probable link between the poor treatment they've received and their mental health. But what depresses me so much about this inflammatory article is that for Shree, it seems to be a zero-sum game. I personally am not okay with transgender individuals feeling marginalized to the point that they commit suicide. It's unacceptable that indigenous people are marginalized to the point of suicide. And I am not okay that Richard felt marginalized to the point of suicide either. There have been so many initiatives in recent years to raise awareness towards circumstances that lead to poor mental health outcomes in marginalized communities. That is a good thing, and we should keep doing that. And now, we have clear evidence of systematic failure in a professional training environment that has led to poor mental health outcomes as well. No one is arguing that we must champion Richard's experience at the expense of other marginalized groups. We could do both. Less suicide is a win all around. Institutional training conducted with dignity and respect for all attendees could have made all the difference, and the way this inclusion training was facilitated does not strike me as particularly inclusive. But in the Toronto Star article, the author laments that Ontario has announced a review of the allegations of Richard's mistreatment with a view to reform professional training. Why does she think that's a bad thing, that we might produce DEI training that doesn't chastise someone who disagrees with the opinion of the instructor? My take is that this is wonderful, because if professional trainers are given a pass to treat people, any person, with such flagrant vitriol and disrespect, then we absolutely should reform professional training. This has been a lot, and there's so much more I could say. But above all, can't we please take off the identity politics lens for just a moment and realize that maintaining dignity and respect for all goes so far in preventing situations like this from occurring. And all means Black people, it means transgender people, it means indigenous people, and it means disabled people. And yes, it also means white male principles. There should be no minority limitation on dignity and respect. Richard strived to decenter race and create environments where all students could thrive, but the Toronto Star piece is a posture to do exactly the opposite and promotes further racial division. The author is right at the beginning of this article when she suggests that some on the right are using Richard's death to attack the progressive left, but she is being just as divisive and inflammatory. What if we chose to be different? To use this tragedy as an opportunity to create better inclusion for everyone, and to stop playing identity politics. Those who knew Richard have told me that's exactly what he would have wanted. And racial justice, social and racial controversial social and racial for people of various ethnicities.